Chapter 1. The Mysterious Manuscript. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Hercule Poirot's London flat, casting delicate patterns on the polished mahogany desk. Poirot sat upright in his chair, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on the package before him. It had arrived without warning, delivered by a courier who vanished as quickly as he had appeared. The brown paper wrapping was unremarkable, but the contents were anything but. With meticulous care, Poirot unwrapped the package. Inside lay a stack of handwritten pages, their edges slightly yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. A faint scent of lavender and something sharper, chemical perhaps, wafted from the papers. He adjusted his pince-nez and began to read. The manuscript was a work of fiction, or so it seemed. It told the story of a wealthy family torn apart by greed, betrayal, and murder. The prose was elegant, the characters vividly drawn, but something about the narrative felt familiar. Poirot's brow furrowed as he reached the final page. The story ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the author had been interrupted, or silenced. Curious, Poirot murmured to himself. He turned the last page over, searching for a signature, a date, anything that might identify the author. There was nothing, only a single word scrawled in the margin. Beware. As he set the manuscript aside, his gaze fell on the envelope it had arrived in. It was plain, with no return address, but the postmark indicated it had been sent from a small village in the English countryside. Poirot picked it up and sniffed delicately. The chemical smell was stronger here, sharp and acrid. Poison? Ishtig, mind raced with possibilities. Before he could ponder further, the doorbell rang. Poirot rose and opened the door to find his friend and confidant, Captain Arthur Hastings, standing on the threshold. "Poirot!" Hastings exclaimed, his face flushed with excitement. "I've just come from the club, and you'll never believe what I overheard." "Ah, Hastings," Poirot interrupted, his eyes gleaming. "Come in. I have something far more intriguing to share with you." Hastings stepped inside, his curiosity piqued. Poirot handed him the manuscript and watched as his friend's expression shifted from confusion to fascination. "Good heavens," Hastings said, flipping through the pages. "This is extraordinary. But why would someone send it to you?" "That, mon ami, is the question," Poirot replied, "and I intend to find the answer." Chapter 2. The ink-stained envelope. Hastings sat across from Poirot, the manuscript spread out on the table between them. His fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the page, a habit Poirot found both endearing and mildly irritating. "So," Hastings began, "you think this manuscript is more than just a story? That it's connected to a real crime?" Poirot leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The timing of its arrival, the abrupt ending, the warning in the margin, it is all too coincidental, do you not think? And then there is the envelope. He picked up the plain brown envelope and held it to the light. The faint chemical smell was still present, though it had begun to fade. Poirot's nose twitched as he inhaled deeply. A poison, perhaps, or something used to mask a poison. The scent is distinctive. Hastings frowned. "But why send it to you? If this is a warning or a threat, why not go to the police?" "Ah, but that is the question, is it not?" Poirot replied, his eyes twinkling. "Perhaps the sender believes I am the only one who can unravel this mystery. Or perhaps they are testing me." He set the envelope down and reached for the manuscript. "Again, let us examine the text more closely. There may be clues hidden within the story itself." As Poirot flipped through the pages, his sharp eyes caught something he had missed earlier. On the back of the final page, barely visible, was a series of numbers and letters scrawled in faint pencil. 5/1920, once, 18 to 19, a code, Hastings asked, leaning forward. "Perhaps," Poirot said, his mind already racing, "or a reference to something, a date, a location, a name. We must decipher it." Before they could delve further, the doorbell rang again. Poirot rose and opened the door to find a young woman standing on the doorstep. She was dressed in a tailored suit, her hair neatly pinned back, but her eyes were wide with anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I need your help. My name is Eleanor Blake, and I believe my life is in danger." Poirot stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in, Mademoiselle Blake. Please, tell us everything." As Eleanor took a seat, she glanced at the manuscript on the table and gasped. "You have it! The manuscript! How did you get it?" Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "It was sent to me anonymously. Do you know who wrote it?" Eleanor hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. I think it was my aunt. She was a writer, but she disappeared 5 years ago. No one ever found out what happened to her." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And you believe this manuscript is connected to her disappearance?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, and I think whoever sent it to you knows the truth and wants you to find it before it's too late." Chapter 3. The Literary Circle. Eleanor Blake's revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken implications. Poirot studied her carefully, noting the faint tremor in her hands and the way her gaze kept darting to the manuscript on the table. "Your aunt," Poirot began, his voice calm but probing. "What was her name?" "Margaret Blake," Eleanor replied. "She was a novelist, quite successful in her day, but she was also private. She didn't like attention. And this manuscript," Poirot said, tapping the pages lightly. "You believe it is hers?" Eleanor nodded. "The handwriting, the style, it's unmistakable. But I don't understand why someone would send it to you now, after all these years." "Perhaps," Poirot mused, "because the story it tells is not entirely fictional. Tell me, Mademoiselle Blake, did your aunt ever mention a group of writers she associated with? A literary circle, perhaps?" Eleanor's eyes widened. "Yes, actually. She used to attend meetings at a place called Blackthorn Manor. It was owned by a wealthy patron of the arts, a man named Victor Grayson. He hosted gatherings for writers, poets, and artists. But after my aunt disappeared, the group disbanded." Poirot leaned forward, his interest piqued. "And this Victor Grayson, where is he now?" "He still lives at Blackthorn Manor, as far as I know," Eleanor said. "But he's become something of a recluse. He rarely leaves the estate." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "It seems, mon ami, that we must pay a visit to Blackthorn Manor." The journey to Blackthorn Manor took them through winding country roads lined with ancient oaks, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The manor itself was an imposing structure of grey stone, its windows dark and foreboding. As they approached the front door, Poirot noticed the overgrown garden and the faint smell of decay in the air. The door was opened by a stern-looking butler, who regarded them with suspicion. "May I help you?" "We are here to see Mr. Victor Grayson," Poirot said, handing the butler his card. "Please inform him that Hercule Poirot wishes to speak with him." The butler hesitated, then stepped aside to allow them entry. The interior of the manor was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old books and dust. They were led to a drawing-room where a man sat by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a gaunt face, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "Mr. Grayson," Poirot said, stepping forward. "Thank you for seeing us." Victor Grayson looked up, his expression guarded. "Hercule Poirot, I've heard of you. What brings you to Blackthorn Manor?" "We are investigating the disappearance of Margaret Blake," Poirot replied. "We understand she was a member of your literary circle." Grayson's grip tightened on his glass. "Margaret, yes, she was. But that was a long time ago. What does her disappearance have to do with me?" "We believe it may be connected to a manuscript she was writing," Poirot said, watching Grayson closely. "A manuscript that has recently come into my possession." For a moment, Grayson's composure faltered. He set his glass down and stood, pacing the room. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Do you not?" Poirot said, his tone mild but insistent. "Then perhaps you can tell us about the other members of your literary circle. Who were they? Where are they now?" Grayson stopped pacing and turned to face Poirot. His expression was unreadable. "If you're looking for answers, Monsieur Poirot, you're wasting your time. The past is best left buried. And yet," Poirot said softly, "it has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it." Chapter 4. The Poisoned Penvictor. Grayson's cryptic warning lingered in the air as Poirot and Hastings left Blackthorn Manor. The drive back to London was quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts. Poirot's mind raced with possibilities, while Hastings fidgeted with the manuscript, flipping through its pages as if the answers might suddenly leap out at him. "Do you think Grayson knows more than he's letting on?" Hastings asked, breaking the silence. "Undoubtedly," Poirot replied. "But he is not the only one with secrets. We must speak to the other members of the literary circle." "And how do we find them?" Hastings asked. "Eleanor said the group disbanded after her aunt disappeared." Poirot smiled faintly. "The manuscript, Hastings. It holds the key. The characters in the story, they are not entirely fictional. They are based on real people. We must identify them." Back at his flat, Poirot spread the manuscript out on his desk and began to analyze it with his usual precision. He noted the names of the characters, their relationships, and the events described. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. "The protagonist," Poirot said, tapping a page, "is a wealthy widow named Lady Constance. She is surrounded by a group of admirers, each with their own motives. One is a jealous cousin, another a scheming lawyer, and a third a charming but unreliable artist. Sound familiar?" Hastings frowned. "You think these characters are based on the members of the literary circle?" "Precisely," Poirot said. "And if we can match the characters to their real-life counterparts, we may uncover the truth about Margaret Blake's disappearance. Their investigation led them to a small art gallery in Chelsea, where they hoped to find the charming but unreliable artist from the manuscript. The gallery was owned by a man named Julian Hart, a painter known for his bohemian lifestyle and scandalous affairs. Hart greeted them with a lazy smile, his paint-stained hands gesturing grandly as he spoke. "Hercule Poirot, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "We are investigating the disappearance of Margaret Blake," Poirot said, cutting straight to the point. "We understand you were a member of Victor Grayson's literary circle." Hart's smile faltered. "That was a long time ago. What does it matter now?" "It matters," Poirot said, "because someone believes the truth is worth uncovering. Tell me, Monsieur Hart, what do you know about the manuscript Margaret was writing?" Hart's face paled. He turned away, busying himself with a stack of canvases. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Do you not?" Poirot said, his voice sharp. "Then perhaps you can explain this." He held up a photograph of the manuscript's final page with the cryptic numbers and letters scrawled in the margin. Hart's eyes widened, and he took a step back. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "It was sent to me," Poirot replied, "along with a warning. Someone knows the truth, Monsieur Hart, and they are not afraid to use it." Before Hart could respond, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the gallery. Poirot and Hastings turned to see a figure darting out the door. Without hesitation, they gave chase. The figure led them through a maze of narrow streets before disappearing into an alley. When Poirot and Hastings reached the spot, they found only a single item lying on the ground: a fountain pen, its nib stained with ink. Poirot picked it up carefully, his nose wrinkling at the faint chemical smell. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious." Hastings frowned. "What is it?" "A poisoned pen," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing, "and I fear it is not the last we will see of it." Chapter 5. The Missing Pages. The poisoned pen was carefully sealed in a glass vial, its chemical scent faint but unmistakable. Poirot placed it on his desk, his mind racing with possibilities. The chase through the streets had yielded no further clues, but the pen itself was a message. A warning, perhaps, or a taunt. "Whoever left this," Poirot said, "wants us to know they are watching. But why? What do they fear we will discover?" Hastings leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "Maybe it's connected to the missing pages of the manuscript. If those pages contain a confession, as you suggested earlier, someone might be desperate to keep them hidden." "Precisely," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming, "and that someone is likely among the members of the literary circle. We must find the missing pages, and quickly." Their next stop was the home of Eleanor Blake, who had agreed to help them piece together the connections between the manuscript and her aunt's disappearance. She greeted them at the door, her face pale but determined. "Any news?" she asked, ushering them inside. "Perhaps," Poirot said. "We have identified one of the characters in the manuscript, a painter named Julian Hart. He was evasive when questioned, and someone attempted to interfere with our investigation." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Do you think he's involved?" "It is possible," Poirot said, "but he is not the only one. Tell me, Mademoiselle Blake, did your aunt keep a diary or any personal writings?" Eleanor hesitated. "She did," but they were all lost after she disappeared. The police searched her home, but they found nothing. Nothing? Poirot repeated, his tone sceptical. Or nothing they were meant to find. He began to pace the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents neatly arranged. A writing desk stood in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers and envelopes. Poirot approached it, his fingers brushing lightly over the items. "Your aunt was a meticulous woman, was she not?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She believed in order and precision." "Then it is unlikely she would have left her most important writings unsecured," Poirot said, "unless—" He knelt beside the desk and examined the underside of the drawer. With a deft movement, he pressed a hidden latch, and a small compartment sprang open. Inside was a bundle of papers, tied with a faded ribbon. Eleanor gasped. "How did you—" "A simple deduction," Poirot said, his smile faint. "Your aunt was a writer of mysteries, after all. It is only fitting that she would leave behind a puzzle of her own." He untied the ribbon and spread the papers out on the desk. They were covered in Margaret Blake's distinctive handwriting, but the content was not what they had expected. Instead of a diary or personal notes, the pages contained a series of coded messages and sketches. "What is this?" Hastings asked, peering over Poirot's shoulder. "A map," Poirot said, his voice tinged with excitement, "and a key to the missing pages of the manuscript." The sketches depicted a series of locations, each marked with a symbol that corresponded to the cryptic numbers and letters from the manuscript's margin. Poirot traced the lines with his finger, his mind working quickly. "These are places connected to the literary circle," he said. "Blackthorn Manor, Julian Hart's gallery, and, here, a library, the Kensington Rare Books collection." "What's there?" Eleanor asked. "The missing pages," Poirot said, "or at least the clue that will lead us to them." The Kensington Rare Books collection was a quiet, dimly lit space filled with towering shelves and the scent of old paper. The librarian, a stern woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, regarded Poirot and Hastings with suspicion. "We are looking for a specific book," Poirot said, handing her a slip of paper with the title The Secrets of Blackthorn Manor. It was published privately in 1925. The librarian's eyes narrowed. "That book is not available to the public." "But it is here," Poirot said, his tone firm, "and we must see it." After a moment's hesitation, the librarian led them to a locked cabinet. She retrieved a slim volume, bound in faded green, leather, and handed it to Poirot. "You may examine it here, but it must not leave the library." Poirot opened the book carefully, his eyes scanning the pages. Near the end, he found what he was looking for, a loose sheet of paper tucked between the pages. It was the missing page from the manuscript, its edges slightly torn, but the text still legible. Hastings leaned in to read it aloud. "The truth is not what it seems. The killer is not who you think. Look to the one who hides in plain sight." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A riddle," he said, "but one that brings us closer to the answer." Chapter 6. The Alibi of Words. The missing page from the manuscript was a tantalizing clue, but its cryptic message left more questions than answers. Poirot studied the words carefully, his mind working to unravel their meaning. "The killer is not who you think," he murmured, pacing the library floor. "And yet the killer is someone we have already encountered, someone who hides in plain sight." Hastings frowned. "But who could that be? We've spoken to Victor Grayson, Julian Hart, and Eleanor Blake. None of them seem like killers." "Ah, but appearances can be deceiving," Poirot said. "And words, Hastings, can be the greatest alibi of all." He turned to the librarian, who was watching them with thinly veiled curiosity. "Madam, do you recall anyone else requesting this book recently?" The librarian adjusted her glasses. "As a matter of fact, yes. A gentleman came in just last week. He said he was researching local history. Can you describe him?" Poirot asked. "Tall, well-dressed, with a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow," the librarian replied. "He seemed nervous." Poirot's eyes lit up. "A scar, you say? That is most interesting. Thank you, madam." As they left the library, Hastings turned to Poirot. "Do you think this man is connected to the case?" "I am certain of it," Poirot said, "but we must proceed carefully. The killer is clever, and they will not hesitate to strike again." Their next stop was the home of Eleanor Blake, who had agreed to help them identify the members of the literary circle. When they arrived, she was waiting for them, her face pale but determined. "Any progress?" she asked. "Some," Poirot said. "We have recovered the missing page from the manuscript, but its message is cryptic. We need your help to identify the other members of the literary circle." Eleanor nodded. "Of course. There were 5 of them in total. My aunt, Victor Grayson, Julian Hart, a lawyer named Charles Whittaker, and a poet named Lydia Marsh." "Charles Whittaker," Poirot repeated. "Tell me about him." "He was my aunt's lawyer," Eleanor said. "He handled her estate and legal affairs. But after she disappeared, he retired and moved to the countryside." "And Lydia Marsh?" Poirot asked. "She was a poet," Eleanor said. "Brilliant, but reclusive. She rarely attended the meetings, but my aunt spoke highly of her." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And do you know if either of them has a scar above the left eyebrow?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "Charles Whittaker does. He got it in a riding accident years ago." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "It seems we must pay a visit to Monsieur Whittaker." Charles Whittaker's home was a modest cottage on the outskirts of a small village. The garden was overgrown, and the curtains were drawn, giving the place an air of neglect. Poirot knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it was opened by a man with a scar above his left eyebrow. "Monsieur Whittaker?" Poirot asked. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "I am Hercule Poirot," he said, "and this is my associate, Captain Hastings. We are investigating the disappearance of Margaret Blake." Whittaker's expression darkened. "That was a long time ago. What does it matter now?" "It matters," Poirot said, "because the truth has a way of resurfacing, and we believe you know more than you have told." Whittaker hesitated, then stepped aside to let them in. The interior of the cottage was cluttered and dimly lit, with stacks of papers and books covering every surface. Poirot's sharp eyes took in every detail, noting the faint smell of ink and the half-finished letter on the desk. "You were Margaret Blake's lawyer," Poirot said, "and a member of the literary circle. Tell me, what happened at Blackthorn Manor all those years ago?" Whittaker sank into a chair, his face pale. "It was supposed to be a celebration. Margaret had just finished her latest novel, and we were all gathered to toast her success. But then, something went wrong. What happened? Hastings asked. There was an argument, Whittaker said. Margaret accused someone of stealing her work. She threatened to expose them, but before she could, she disappeared. And you did nothing? Poirot asked, his tone sharp. What could I do? Whittaker replied. I had no proof, and I was afraid. Afraid of what? Poirot pressed. Whittaker looked away. Afraid of the truth. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And what is the truth, Monsieur Whittaker? Who stole Margaret Blake's work? And who killed her? Whittaker's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water. I don't know, but if you want answers, you should speak to Lydia Marsh. She was there that night. She saw everything. Chapter 7. The Ghostwriter's Secret. The name Lydia Marsh hung in the air like a shadow, heavy with unspoken implications. Poirot's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. A reclusive poet, a witness to Margaret Blake's final hours. What secrets did she hold? We must find her, Poirot said, his voice firm. She is the key to this mystery. Hastings nodded. But where do we start? Eleanor said Lydia rarely attended the meetings. She could be anywhere. Not anywhere, Poirot corrected. She is a poet, and poets, like all artists, leave traces of themselves in their work. We must follow the trail of her words. Their search led them to a small bookstore in Bloomsbury, its windows filled with dusty volumes and handwritten signs. The proprietor, an elderly man with a kind face, greeted them warmly. Lydia Marsh, he said when Poirot inquired. Yes, I remember her. She used to come in often, always looking for rare editions of poetry, but I haven't seen her in years. Do you know where she might be now? Poirot asked. The man hesitated. There's a place, a cottage in the Cotswolds. She mentioned it once, said she wanted to live there, away from the noise of the city. But I couldn't tell you exactly where. Poirot's eyes gleamed. It is a start. Thank you, monsieur. The Cotswolds were a patchwork of rolling hills and quaint villages, their stone cottages nestled among fields of green. Poirot and Hastings drove from village to village, asking after Lydia Marsh, but no one seemed to know her. Finally, in a tiny hamlet called Wisteria Hollow, they found a clue. An elderly woman tending her garden pointed them toward a cottage on the edge of the woods. She keeps to herself, the woman said, but you'll know her place by the roses. They grow wild all around it. The cottage was exactly as described, its stone walls covered in climbing roses, their blooms a riot of colour. Poirot knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it was opened by a woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Lydia Marsh, Poirot asked. The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. Who's asking? I am Hercule Poirot, he said, and this is my associate, Captain Hastings. We are investigating the disappearance of Margaret Blake. Lydia's expression softened, and she stepped aside to let them in. The cottage was small but cosy, its walls lined with bookshelves and its windows filled with light. A writing desk stood in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers and ink bottles. I wondered when someone would come, Lydia said, her voice quiet but steady. I've been waiting for years. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Waiting for what, mademoiselle? For someone to ask the right questions, she replied. For someone to care about the truth. She gestured for them to sit, then took a seat herself, her hands folded in her lap. "Margaret was my friend," she began, "and she was brilliant, but she was also vulnerable. She trusted too easily." "What happened that night at Blackthorn Manor?" Hastings asked. Lydia's gaze grew distant. "There was an argument. Margaret had discovered that someone in the literary circle had been stealing her work, passing it off as their own. She confronted them, and things turned ugly." "Who was it?" Poirot asked. Lydia hesitated. "I don't know for certain, but I suspect it was Victor Grayson. He was always jealous of her talent, and he had the most to gain." "But why did Margaret disappear?" Hastings pressed. "Because she was afraid," Lydia said, "afraid of what they might do to her. She came to me that night, begging for help. I told her to hide, to wait until it was safe. But she never came back." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes intent. "And the manuscript? Do you know what happened to it?" Lydia nodded. "Margaret gave it to me for safekeeping. She said it contained the truth about the theft, about the literary circle, about everything. But before I could read it, it was stolen." "By whom?" Poirot asked. "I don't know," Lydia said. "But I believe it was someone close to her, someone she trusted." Poirot's mind raced as he pieced together the clues. The stolen manuscript, the poisoned pen, the cryptic message, it all pointed to one conclusion. "Mademoiselle Marsh," he said, "you said Margaret gave you the manuscript for safekeeping. Did she give you anything else?" Lydia hesitated, then stood and walked to the writing desk. She opened a drawer and retrieved a small leather-bound journal. "This," she said, handing it to Poirot. "It's her diary. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment to reveal it." Poirot took the journal and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Margaret's distinctive handwriting, her thoughts and observations laid bare. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes fell on an entry dated just days before her disappearance. "I have discovered the truth," it read. "But it is a truth I cannot bear to face. The one I trusted most has betrayed me. If anything happens, to me know this: the killer hides in plain sight." Poirot closed the journal, his expression grave. "Mademoiselle Marsh, you have been most helpful, but there is one more thing I must ask." "What is it?" Lydia asked. "The missing pages." "Of the manuscript," Poirot said. "Do you know where they are?" Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "No," she whispered, "but I fear they may hold the key to Margaret's fate." Chapter 8. The Final Deduction. The diary of Margaret Blake was a treasure trove of secrets, its pages filled with cryptic notes and veiled accusations. Poirot spent the night poring over its contents, his sharp mind piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. By morning, he had reached a conclusion. "It is clear now," he said to Hastings, his voice tinged with both satisfaction and sorrow. "The killer is not who we thought. They have been hiding in plain sight all along." Hastings frowned. "But who? We've spoken to everyone in the literary circle. Victor Grayson, Julian Hart, Charles Whittaker, Lydia Marsh. None of them seem capable of murder." "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, mon ami," Poirot said. "The killer is not among them. The killer is someone we have overlooked, someone who has been manipulating events from the very beginning." Hastings' eyes widened. "Who?" Poirot smiled faintly. "You will see. But first we must gather everyone together." The time has come for the final revelation. The meeting took place at Blackthorn Manor, its grand halls echoing with tension as the members of the literary circle assembled. Victor Grayson sat stiffly in an armchair, his face pale. Julian Hart leaned against the fireplace, his expression guarded. Charles Whittaker fidgeted with his glasses, while Lydia Marsh stood by the window, her hands clasped tightly. Eleanor Blake sat beside Poirot, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. Poirot stood before them, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "thank you for coming. I have called you here today to reveal the truth about Margaret Blake's disappearance and the murder that followed." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Victor Grayson leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Murder? What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the fact that Margaret Blake did not simply disappear," Poirot said. "She was killed by someone in this room." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Julian Hart broke the silence, his voice trembling. "That's impossible. We were all friends. None of us would have hurt her." "Ah, but you are wrong," Poirot said. "One of you did, and I will now reveal who." He stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the room. The key to this mystery lies in the manuscript Margaret was writing. It was not merely a work of fiction. It was a confession of the theft, the betrayal, and the murder that followed. He held up the missing page they had recovered from the library. "The killer is not who you think," he read aloud. "Look to the one who hides in plain sight." "But who is that?" Charles Whittaker asked, his voice shaking. Poirot turned to Eleanor Blake. "Mademoiselle Blake, would you please stand?" Eleanor rose slowly, her face pale but composed. "Monsieur Poirot, what are you saying?" "I am saying," Poirot replied, "that you are the killer." The room erupted in gasps and protests, but Poirot held up a hand for silence. "Let me explain. Eleanor, you were not merely Margaret's niece, you were her ghostwriter. You helped her craft her novels, but you grew resentful of the lack of recognition. When you discovered that Victor Grayson was stealing her work, you saw an opportunity. You convinced Margaret to confront him, knowing it would lead to a confrontation. And then, when the moment was right, you killed her and framed Grayson for the crime." Eleanor's face twisted in anger. "That's ridiculous. I loved my aunt. I would never hurt her." "And yet," Poirot said, "the evidence is clear. The poisoned pen, the missing pages, the coded messages, all of it points to you. You sent the manuscript to me because you wanted to expose Grayson, but you underestimated my ability to see through your deception." Eleanor's composure cracked, and she sank into her chair, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean to kill her," she whispered. "I just wanted her to stop. She was going to ruin everything." The room fell silent as the truth sank in. Victor Grayson stood, his face filled with a mixture of anger and relief. "You," he said, pointing at Eleanor, "you destroyed her life and mine." Poirot stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "The police are on their way, mademoiselle. Blake, it is over." As the officers led Eleanor away, Poirot stood by the window, his expression thoughtful. Hastings joined him, his face filled with admiration. "Brilliant, Poirot," he said. "Absolutely brilliant." Poirot shook his head. "No, Hastings, it is not brilliance, It is simply the truth, and the truth, no matter how painful, must always be revealed. Chapter 9. The Last Page. The aftermath of Eleanor Blake's confession left the members of the literary circle in a state of shock. Victor Grayson, Julian Hart, Charles Whittaker, and Lydia Marsh gathered in the drawing-room of Blackthorn Manor, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Poirot stood before them, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful. "It is over," he said. "The truth has been revealed, and justice will be served. But there is one final piece of the puzzle that remains." He held up the missing page from the manuscript, its words now clear and unmistakable. "The truth is not what it seems," he read aloud. "The killer is not who you think. Look to the one who hides in plain sight." "But you've already solved it," Julian Hart said, his voice tinged with confusion. "Eleanor was the killer." "Ah, but there is more," Poirot said. "This page is not merely a clue, it is a confession. A confession written by Margaret Blake herself." The room fell silent as Poirot continued. "Margaret knew she was in danger. She suspected that someone close to her was plotting against her, but she did not know who. So she wrote this manuscript, embedding the truth within its pages. And she entrusted the final page to Lydia Marsh, knowing it would one day lead to the truth." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't understand," she whispered. "I thought it was just a story." "It was a story," Poirot said gently. "But it was also a warning, and now, at last, we have the full picture." He turned to the group, his gaze steady. "Margaret Blake was a brilliant writer, but she was also a woman of great courage. She risked everything to expose the truth, and in doing so, she ensured that her legacy would live on." Victor Grayson stood, his face filled with regret. "I owe her an apology," he said. "I was jealous of her talent, and I let that jealousy cloud my judgment. But I never wanted her to come to harm. None of us did," Charles Whittaker added. "She was our friend, and we failed her." Poirot nodded. "It is a lesson we must all remember. The pursuit of art and fame can sometimes lead us astray, but it is our humanity that defines us. Margaret Blake understood that, and it is a lesson we must carry forward." As the group dispersed, Poirot and Hastings made their way to the garden, where the roses bloomed in vibrant hues. Hastings took a deep breath, savouring the scent of the flowers. "It's a shame, isn't it?" he said. "All that talent, all that potential, gone." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but Margaret's words will live on, and in that she has achieved a kind of immortality." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the final page of the manuscript. "This," he said, "is her last gift to us. A reminder that the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth seeking." Hastings smiled. "You're right, Poirot, and I'm glad we were able to uncover it." Poirot nodded, his eyes twinkling. "As am I, Hastings, as am I." Epilogue. The manuscript was published posthumously under Margaret Blake's name, its pages a testament to her brilliance and courage. The literary circle disbanded, its members going their separate ways, but the lessons they had learned stayed with them. Poirot returned to his flat in London, his mind already turning to the next mystery. But as he sat at his desk, sipping a cup of tea, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. "The truth," he murmured, "is like a rose, beautiful but with thorns that can pierce the heart. And yet, we must always strive to uncover it. With that, he set down his cup and opened a new case file, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And so concludes Hercule Poirot and the Poisoned Pen Mystery, the manuscript that hid a deadly secret. I hope you enjoyed the story.